Most people think denial is simple. A person is confronted with the truth and refuses to admit it. But denial is rarely that clean. Because in serious criminal cases, denial isn't just about facts. It's about identity. It's about protecting a version of the self that cannot survive the truth. And that's what makes denial so disturbing. If a person confesses, the story ends psychologically. There's an endpoint, but denial has no endpoint. Denial continues the conflict. It keeps the victim's reality in suspension. It keeps the public locked in argument. It keeps the offender's self-image intact. And in some cases, denial becomes more than a defense. It becomes a structure, a psychological architecture built to resist collapse. This documentary is not about whether you personally believe Scott Peterson. It is about denial as a mechanism, how it forms, how it hardens, and why some criminal minds would rather rewrite reality than surrender control. If you've ever wondered why certain offenders will maintain a story for decades, even when it costs them everything, you're not looking at stubbornness. You're looking at a mind that experiences truth as annihilation. When people hear the word denial, they often picture a liar, someone who knows exactly what happened and simply refuses to admit it. They imagine denial as a conscious decision. I'm going to say, I didn't do it. But denial is often more complex than deception, because lies are what you tell other people. Denial is what you tell yourself. That distinction is crucial. A liar can admit the truth privately. A person in denial often cannot. Or, more precisely, they cannot fully integrate the truth into their identity without psychological collapse. This is why denial becomes so persistent. It is not always maintained because it works legally. It is maintained because it works internally. Denial is a defense mechanism, an internal strategy the mind uses to avoid emotional overload, shame, and self-destruction. And in everyday life, denial can be small. A person ignores a health problem. A person pretends a relationship isn't failing. A person refuses to accept that their career has stalled. But in criminal cases, denial becomes something else. It stops being a temporary shield and starts becoming an entire worldview. This is where the public often misreads denial. They assume denial is simply the absence of honesty. But denial can be the presence of an internal system that cannot allow truth to exist. To understand that, you have to separate denial from several other behaviors that look similar. First, deception. Deception is strategic. A deceptive person knows the truth and chooses to hide it. They often show signs of management, careful wording, calculated emotion, selective memory. Deception involves external control. Denial does not require that level of strategy. Denial can look calm, repetitive, even boring, because it is not being actively constructed in the moment. It is being protected. Second, minimization. Minimization is not "it didn't happen." Minimization is "it happened, but it wasn't that bad." This is common in offenders who admit some facts but reduce meaning. They may acknowledge an affair but deny emotional significance. They may acknowledge contact but deny intent. They may acknowledge harm but deny responsibility. Minimization is a halfway house between truth and self-image. Third, rationalization. Rationalization is the mind's way of turning wrongdoing into reason. Not "I did it, but I had to," or "anyone would," or "it wasn't really my fault." Rationalization is moral camouflage. It helps a person keep a positive self-story while still living with facts. Fourth, dissociation. Dissociation is not denial in the ordinary sense. Dissociation is when the mind disconnects from experience, fragmenting memory, emotion, and bodily reality. A dissociative person may not be able to access the truth coherently, not because they refuse it, but because the mind has separated from it. This is rarer, more clinical, and not something we assume without evidence. And finally, impression management. This is where a person performs innocence rather than experiencing it. They focus on how they appear: cooperative, calm, reasonable, victimized. Impression management can exist with or without denial, but it often hides in the same space. Now here's the key point. In high-profile criminal cases, these categories blur. A person can be both strategic and in denial. A person can be lying externally while also protecting an internal story. And that's where Scott Peterson becomes such a powerful case study. Because the question is not simply, was he lying? The deeper question is, what kind of mind maintains denial under extreme consequence? Because maintaining denial for days is one thing. Maintaining denial for months is another. Maintaining denial for years, while the world condemns you, while your life collapses, while the consequences become permanent. That's not just stubbornness. That is a psychological position with structural reinforcement. To understand how denial becomes structural, we have to consider what truth threatens. Truth does not just threaten freedom. Truth threatens identity. For many offenders, admitting the truth is not simply admitting an act. It is admitting a self-definition they cannot tolerate. It is saying, I'm the kind of person who did this. And that statement is psychologically heavier than people realize. Because humans survive through story. We build a narrative of who we are. I'm a good husband. I'm a hardworking man. I'm not the type. I could never. This narrative is not just ego. It is a scaffold. It organizes choices, relationships, self-worth, and future imagination. When a crime contradicts that scaffold, the mind experiences an identity threat. And identity threats trigger defenses. Sometimes those defenses are emotional. Tears, panic, collapse. Sometimes those defenses are cognitive, distortion, splitting, rewriting reality. Denial is one of the strongest cognitive defenses because denial doesn't negotiate. Denial eliminates conflict by refusing the fact that creates it. And this is why denial can feel so cold to outsiders. Outsiders assume guilt produces emotional turmoil. But if denial removes the internal conflict, emotional turmoil may never surface. Or it may surface in strange, indirect ways. Irritation at unfair treatment, obsession with minor details, anger at the media, focus on procedure rather than loss. This can look heartless, but psychologically, it may be the mind's way of protecting the internal story. Now, here is the part many people do not want to admit. Denial is not always conscious. People imagine denial as a deliberate lie repeated every day. But denial can operate like a filter. The mind selectively permits information that supports the internal story, and it blocks information that threatens it. This is why people in denial can sound sincere, because in a limited way they may sincerely believe they're framing. They may sincerely experience themselves as wronged. They may sincerely feel that the system is unfair. This is not innocence. This is psychological self-preservation. And in some criminal minds, self-preservation becomes the highest value. Higher than truth, higher than responsibility, higher than empathy. This is why denial is often paired with another feature, narrative rigidity. A person in structural denial does not adapt easily. They repeat, they circle, they return to the same framing. Because changing the story is not just changing words, it is destabilizing the self. This can make denial look almost religious. Not because the person is spiritual, but because the person is defending a sacred identity. Now we have to be careful here. This documentary is not claiming that denial proves guilt. Innocent people can also deny accusations. They can deny fiercely. They can deny for decades. But the psychological mechanics differ. An innocent person's denial often comes with emotional variability. Their fear changes. Their anger changes. Their despair rises and falls. Their story may remain consistent, but their emotional state often shows exhaustion. Structural denial often looks different. It looks insulated. It looks stable. It looks like a person who is not being eroded by time. And that lack of erosion is what unsettles people most. Because time is supposed to do something. Time is supposed to weaken lies. Time is supposed to crack performance. Time is supposed to create emotional leakage. When time does not, the public assumes the person is either extraordinarily disciplined or fundamentally disconnected. This is where denial becomes more than an argument about truth. It becomes a window into how certain minds resist reality. And that resistance is not always loud. It can be quiet. It can be calm. It can be procedural. It can sound like this. I've told you everything. I didn't do it. There's nothing else to say. Not an explosion. A wall. Denial, at its most advanced stage, is not a battle. It is a fortress. And fortresses are built for one purpose: to keep something out. What is being kept out is not just evidence. It is psychological collapse. Because if the truth enters fully, the internal story dies. And for some people, the internal story is more vital than freedom, more vital than relationships, more vital than public perception, even more vital than life itself as it used to exist. This is why denial can persist even when it offers no benefit. Because the benefit is internal. It allows the person to remain someone they can live with. Now ask yourself, why would a person need denial that strong? Because the truth they're resisting is not just punishment. It is annihilation. In the next chapter, we're going to go deeper into that concept. We will examine why the mind resists truth, not as moral weakness, but as a psychological survival response. And we will look at the moment when denial stops being something a person does and becomes something a person is. Denial eliminates conflict by refusing the fact that creates it. And this is why denial can feel so cold to outsiders. Outsiders assume guilt produces emotional turmoil. But if denial removes the internal conflict, emotional turmoil may never surface. Or it may surface in strange, indirect ways. Irritation at unfair treatment, obsession with minor details, anger at the media, focus on procedure rather than loss. This can look heartless, but psychologically, it may be the mind's way of protecting the internal story. Now, here is the part many people do not want to admit. Denial is not always conscious. People imagine denial as a deliberate lie repeated every day. But denial can operate like a filter. The mind selectively permits information that supports the internal story, and it blocks information that threatens it. This is why people in denial can sound sincere, because in a limited way they may sincerely believe they're framing. They may sincerely experience themselves as wronged. They may sincerely feel that the system is unfair. This is not innocence. This is psychological self-preservation. And in some criminal minds, self-preservation becomes the highest value. Higher than truth, higher than responsibility, higher than empathy. This is why denial is often paired with another feature: narrative rigidity. A person in structural denial does not adapt easily. They repeat, they circle, they return to the same framing. Because changing the story is not just changing words. It is destabilizing the self. This can make denial look almost religious. Not because the person is spiritual, but because the person is defending a sacred identity. Now we have to be careful here. This documentary is not claiming that denial proves guilt. Innocent people can also deny accusations. They can deny fiercely. They can deny for decades. But the psychological mechanics differ. An innocent person's denial often comes with emotional variability. Their fear changes. Their anger changes. Their despair rises and falls. Their story may remain consistent, but their emotional state often shows exhaustion. Structural denial often looks different. It looks insulated. It looks stable. It looks like a person who is not being eroded by time. And that lack of erosion is what unsettles people most. Because time is supposed to do something. Time is supposed to weaken lies. Time is supposed to crack performance. Time is supposed to create emotional leakage. When time does not, the public assumes the person is either extraordinarily disciplined or fundamentally disconnected. This is where denial becomes more than an argument about truth. It becomes a window into how certain minds resist reality. And that resistance is not always loud. It can be quiet. It can be calm. It can be procedural. It can sound like this. I've told you everything. I didn't do it. There's nothing else to say. Not an explosion. A wall. Denial, at its most advanced stage, is not a battle. It is a fortress. And fortresses are built for one purpose: to keep something out. What is being kept out is not just evidence. It is psychological collapse. Because if the truth enters fully, the internal story dies. And for some people, The internal story is more vital than freedom, more vital than relationships, more vital than public perception, even more vital than life itself as it used to exist. This is why denial can persist even when it offers no benefit, because the benefit is internal. It allows the person to remain someone they can live with. Now ask yourself, why would a person need denial that strong? Because the truth they're resisting is not just punishment. It is annihilation. In the next chapter, we're going to go deeper into that concept. We will examine why the mind resists truth, not as moral weakness, but as a psychological survival response. And we will look at the moment when denial stops being something a person does and becomes something a person is. There's a simple question people ask when they watch a defendant deny something that seems impossible to deny. Why not just admit it? Why keep fighting the obvious? Why drag it out when the outcome is already set? On the surface, it seems irrational. Because confession looks like relief. Confession looks like surrender. Confession looks like the end of suffering. But for some minds, confession is not relief. Confession is collapse. Not legal collapse. Identity collapse. To understand why the mind resists truth, you have to understand what truth does inside the self. Truth is not only information. Truth is a force. It rearranges memory, meaning, reputation, and self-definition. It does not simply sit inside the mind. It changes the mind structure. That is why the mind resists it, especially when the truth threatens a core identity. When most people imagine denial, they imagine pride. They imagine arrogance. They imagine someone refusing to admit they were wrong. But denial, in its deepest form, is not pride. It is survival. It is the mind's attempt to prevent psychological annihilation. Because the human mind is not built to hold unlimited shame. Shame is one of the most destructive emotions a person can experience. Not guilt. Shame. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I'm something wrong. Guilt can be repaired through accountability. Shame feels like permanent contamination. And when shame becomes intolerable, the mind defends itself. Sometimes through anger, sometimes through numbness, sometimes through blame, and sometimes through denial. Denial is the mind's way of saying, if I accept this, I will not survive what it makes me. Now, the public often assumes that if someone did something terrible, they should be flooded with shame. But that assumption is not universally true. Some people do experience overwhelming shame after wrongdoing. They collapse emotionally. They confess. They self-harm. They beg for forgiveness. But other people do not process wrongdoing through guilt and shame in the same way. Instead, they experience threat through a different pathway. Loss of control, loss of image, loss of self-story. For these individuals, the danger is not emotional guilt. The danger is identity exposure. And denial becomes a method of preventing exposure. This is the first pillar of truth resistance, identity threat. Every person carries an internal narrative that stabilizes them. I'm the good guy. I'm the victim. I'm the reasonable one. I'm the kind of person who would never. This narrative functions like psychological scaffolding. It supports self-worth. It organizes behavior. It gives people a sense of who they are in the world. When a truth enters that contradicts the narrative, the mind experiences dissonance. Cognitive dissonance. This is not just being uncomfortable. Cognitive dissonance is a state of internal conflict where two realities cannot coexist. Reality A, I am a decent person. Reality B, I committed an unforgivable act. For emotionally engaged people, dissonance produces distress. For people who depend heavily on self-image, dissonance produces panic. Because if reality B becomes true, reality A dies. And for some people, reality A is not optional. It is survival. So the mind tries to resolve dissonance. There are only a few ways to resolve it. One way is accountability. Accept the truth and rebuild identity. That is the healthy solution. But it is painful. It requires emotional endurance. It requires humility. It requires the capacity to tolerate shame and rebuild from ruins. Not everyone can do that. Another way is distortion. Alter reality B so it no longer threatens reality A. This is where denial and rationalization appear. The mind edits reality until it fits the self-story. It's not true. It's exaggerated. It's misunderstood. It's unfair. It's not what it looks like. It's someone else's fault. This is not simply lying. It is reality management. And the more severe the truth, the more extreme the management becomes. This is the second pillar of truth resistance, shame avoidance. Even people with limited empathy often fear shame. Not moral shame, social shame. Shame as exposure. Shame as humiliation. Shame as being seen clearly. For some minds, being seen clearly is unbearable, because being seen clearly means losing control of the narrative. This is why denial often includes a strong focus on reputation. Not necessarily I miss my family or I miss my old life, but I'm being portrayed unfairly. This is why some deniers fixate on media coverage. They watch how they are described. They obsess over wording. They correct small details. They argue about tone. Because their deepest fear is not consequence. It is being defined by others. This is why denial is often paired with a particular kind of hostility. Not hostility toward the victim. Hostility toward the people who claim to know the truth. Police, media, prosecutors, witnesses, anyone who threatens to fix the narrative permanently. Denial becomes resistance to definition. It is the refusal to be pinned down. Now, the third pillar of truth resistance is control. This is where denial stops looking like fear and starts looking like power. People assume denial is weakness, a person unable to admit reality. But denial can also be dominance, because to deny is to refuse another person's authority over truth. Denial says, you do not get to define my reality, even if you have evidence, even if you have witnesses, even if the world believes you. Denial is not only about facts. It is about who has the right to declare them. This is why denial can be maintained even when it is irrational, because it serves a power function. It keeps the offender in a position of authorship. They remain the narrator. They remain the center. They remain the one who decides what is true. This is why denial can become addictive, because once a person has built their internal world around control, surrender becomes impossible. Confession would be surrender, not only to the legal system, to reality itself. And for some minds, surrender feels like death. This is the fourth pillar of truth resistance, fear of collapse. Not fear of prison, fear of internal collapse. A person who has lived through life by controlling narrative may have no psychological tools for rebuilding after exposure. They do not know how to be ordinary. They do not know how to be flawed. They do not know how to be someone who did something unforgivable and still exist. So denial becomes the only way to remain intact. It is not always comfortable, but it is stable. Denial is often less painful than confession, because confession forces transformation. Denial allows stasis, and stasis is the mind's preferred state under threat. Now, at this point, a viewer might ask, but what about innocent people? Innocent people resist truth too, don't they? Yes. Innocent people can deny for decades. They can refuse plea deals. They can fight until they die. Because for them, the truth they are resisting is not guilt. It's false identity annihilation. A wrongful conviction can destroy identity too. So we cannot use denial as proof. What we can do is study the mechanism, how the denial is structured, what it protects, what it prioritizes, what it sacrifices. This is where denial becomes psychologically informative, because denial reveals what a person cannot tolerate. Denial points to the nerve, not necessarily the crime, but the internal threat. For some, the nerve is shame. For others, the nerve is power. For others, the nerve is dependency. And for others, the nerve is the loss of an image they spent their life constructing. Now, bring this back to Scott Peterson. The reason denial remains such a central feature of public fascination is not just that he denied. It's the quality of the denial, the steadiness, the repetition, the lack of visible psychological erosion, the refusal to collapse in the way people expected him to collapse. This steadiness can have several explanations. One explanation is strategy. A legal strategy maintained over time. But strategy usually produces stress. Strategy requires constant adjustment. Strategy leaks fatigue. Another explanation is psychological insulation. A mind structured to resist emotional collapse by sealing off reality. This kind of insulation does not look like struggle. It looks like stability. And that stability terrifies people because it suggests the person is not wrestling with truth. They are living without it. This is the key insight of this chapter. The mind resists truth when truth threatens the self more than punishment does. And in some criminal minds, punishment is external, but self-collapse is internal. An internal threat is the one they cannot survive. So they resist. They maintain the story. They repeat the phrase. They correct small details. They object to definitions. They refuse the endpoint, because the endpoint would mean accepting a new identity, and that identity is unlivable. In the next chapter, we're going to map denial into a clearer structure, not as one behavior, but as layers, because denial is rarely one statement. It is a system of defenses stacked on top of each other. And once you see the layers, you begin to understand why denial can last for decades, and why in some minds it never ends. When people talk about denial, they usually treat it like a single behavior. A person is accused. A person says, "I didn't do it." End of story. But denial is rarely one wall. It is usually a building, a layered structure made of different psychological defenses, each layer designed to protect the one underneath. That is why denial can last so long. Because when one layer cracks, another layer absorbs the pressure. And if you don't understand the layers, you won't understand why a person can keep resisting truth even when facts seem overwhelming. In criminal psychology, denial often unfolds in three major layers. Layer 1 is the most obvious. Layer 2 is more subtle. Layer 3 is the most dangerous because it can survive almost anything. Layer 1, denial of facts. This is the simplest form and the one most people recognize. It didn't happen. I wasn't there. You've got the wrong person. That's not what occurred. This is the denial of reality itself. In everyday life, denial of facts is usually temporary. A person refuses to accept a diagnosis. A person refuses to believe a loved one is gone. A person rejects a painful truth. But over time, reality forces itself in. In serious criminal cases, denial of facts can persist longer, especially if evidence is incomplete, time is early, or the offender believes the system can be managed. But here's what's important. Denial of facts is the easiest layer to break. Why? Because facts are external. Facts don't care about narrative. Facts can be documented, measured, confirmed. When the legal system builds enough evidence, denial of facts becomes unstable. At that point, most minds shift, because if you keep denying facts that everyone can prove, you start to look absurd. And absurdity threatens credibility. So people often move to layer 2. Layer 2, denial of meaning. This is where denial becomes psychologically sophisticated. The person may stop denying the facts entirely. They may admit certain realities, but they deny what those realities mean. Yes, but, okay, that's true, but it doesn't mean what you think. I did that, but it was harmless. I said that, but it was taken out of context. That happened, but it doesn't prove anything. This layer is powerful because it allows a person to appear honest while still protecting the self-story. They concede small truths to defend larger ones. They allow facts in, but strip them of emotional and moral significance. This is how many offenders survive the pressure of evidence. They start negotiating. They accept what cannot be denied, but they refuse the interpretation that makes them guilty. This is why denial can look reasonable. Because in layer 2, the person stops fighting reality and starts fighting perception. They become obsessed with framing. What does this mean? How does it look? How will people interpret it? They may say things like, "You're assuming." That's speculation. You're twisting it. You're connecting dots that don't connect. This is not necessarily false on its face. Sometimes, people do jump to conclusions. But in denial, this language becomes a fortress. Because if you can keep the meaning uncertain, you can keep identity intact. Layer 2 is denial through ambiguity. It is the art of making the truth technically possible, but emotionally undecidable. And this is where denial can become endless, because meaning is more negotiable than facts. Facts are rigid. Meaning is elastic. You can stretch meaning until it loses force. That's why Layer 2 is so effective. But even Layer 2 can break, because eventually, meaning becomes unavoidable. The evidence doesn't just point to facts, it creates moral certainty. At that point, the mind often shifts again to Layer 3. Layer 3, denial of responsibility. This is the deepest layer, and the one that can survive even when a person is fully surrounded by reality. In this layer, the person may no longer deny facts. They may no longer deny meaning entirely, but they deny responsibility. They deny ownership. They deny moral accountability. And they do it through a set of familiar routes. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. I was forced. I had no choice. It wasn't really me. I was in a different state. Anyone would have done the same. It's not what it looks like. This layer is where denial becomes structurally fused to identity, because responsibility is the point where self-story collapses. Facts can be conceded, meaning can be debated, but responsibility is final. Responsibility says, I am the author, and that is what many deniers cannot tolerate, because responsibility transforms identity. Responsibility becomes moral redefinition. If a person accepts responsibility for something unforgivable, they must either rebuild the self from ruins or admit there's someone they cannot live with. This is why many offenders never reach this layer openly. They stop at Layer 1 or 2 and stay there, repeating the same phrases. But even if they never speak Layer 3 can exist internally. A person can privately accept facts and still resist responsibility. They might never say it out loud, because saying it out loud would finalize it. This is why confession matters. Confession is a public acceptance of responsibility. It is the psychological endpoint, but denial blocks endpoints. Now, here's the key insight. These 3 layers often operate simultaneously. A person might deny facts in one area while denying meaning in another and denying responsibility in a third. They can admit an affair, but deny its significance. They can admit being present, but deny intent. They can admit contact, but deny causality. Denial is not a straight line. It is a web, and the web is designed to do one thing: protect the self-story. Now, apply this lens to Scott Peterson. The public often debates denial as if it's one statement: I didn't do it. But the long-term fascination comes from how denial functions as a system. Because his denial did not only resist facts, it resisted the moral interpretation of the case. It resisted the meaning society placed on his behavior. It resisted the identity label the public wanted to impose. Denial, in that sense, was not just I'm innocent. It was, you do not get to define me. And that is why denial becomes more than defense. It becomes control. It becomes power, even in defeat, especially in defeat. Because when you lose externally, the only thing you can still control is internal authorship. Your story, your framing, your identity. This is why some offenders cling to denial even when it offers no legal benefit. Because at that stage, denial is not legal strategy. It is psychological survival. It preserves the last domain of control, the self. Now, here is the reason denial feels darker than confession. Confession ends the moral violence. It gives the victim's reality confirmation. It acknowledges the truth. Denial keeps reality suspended. It forces everyone to keep arguing. It forces the victim's family to keep hearing the offender's version. It keeps the case emotionally alive. It prolongs pain. Even if that is not the intention, it is the effect. This is why denial can feel like a continuing act. Not because the crime is still happening, but because moral recognition is still being withheld. And withholding recognition is psychologically violent. Now you might think, so what breaks denial? What collapses the layers? Sometimes evidence breaks layer 1. Sometimes public pressure breaks layer 2. Sometimes time breaks the system. But in some minds, denial survives everything. Because it is not protecting the truth. It is protecting the self-story. And if the self-story is more important than reality, denial becomes permanent. In the next chapter, we will examine the moment where denial stops being a reaction to accusation and becomes a way of living. Because at that point, denial is no longer something a person does under pressure. It becomes their identity strategy. And when denial becomes a lifestyle, truth is not just avoided. Truth is treated like an enemy. There's a difference between denial as a moment and denial as a method. Most people experience denial temporarily. A harsh truth arrives. The mind rejects it. The nervous system buys time. But eventually, reality forces adaptation. We grieve. We accept. We rebuild. That is how denial is supposed to work, as a short bridge between shock and integration. But in certain personalities, especially those organized around control, image, and self-preservation, denial does not function as a bridge. It functions as an operating system. And when denial becomes an operating system, it no longer exists only inside the courtroom. It shows up in relationships, in routines, in how a person speaks, in what a person refuses to acknowledge, in what a person never feels obligated to repair. This is what it means when denial becomes a lifestyle. It means the person is not merely denying a crime. They're living through a psychological strategy that has likely existed long before the crime. And the crime is simply where the strategy becomes visible. To understand denial as a lifestyle, you have to understand the concept of narrative maintenance. Most people maintain a self-story, but they allow it to evolve. They can admit mistakes. They can accept embarrassment. They can tolerate being seen as imperfect. Their identity can absorb reality. But some people cannot absorb reality if it threatens their self-story. They manage reality instead. They select what is allowed into the narrative. They exclude what destabilizes the narrative. They rewrite details until the narrative remains intact. This becomes a habit, not always conscious, but continuous. And over time, this habit becomes character. You can often see this pattern in everyday life long before any criminal crisis. A person avoids accountability in small ways. They reframe conflicts so they're always the reasonable one. They turn criticism into persecution. They make other people feel too emotional. They use calmness as superiority. When something goes wrong, they don't examine their role. They examine how they are being perceived. And most importantly, they protect the image of themselves as someone who could never be guilty. This is the seed of lifestyle denial. It is a refusal to be emotionally penetrated by reality. Not because reality is unknown, but because reality is intolerable. Now, lifestyle denial does not always look like loud defiance. In fact, it often looks like the opposite. It looks like stability. A person continues working, continues routines, continues social behavior. They appear functional. They appear composed. They appear, at times, strangely normal. And that normalness is what alarms people. Because when the world is in crisis, normalness can look like detachment. But lifestyle denial is not always emotional detachment. It can be strategic normalness, a psychological decision, conscious or unconscious, to refuse emotional disruption. Because emotional disruption threatens control. And control is the currency of the identity. Lifestyle denial also has a signature feature, selective reality. The person acknowledges certain truths, but keeps them isolated. They will discuss logistics, details, procedures. They will talk about what they did that day. They will talk about schedules. But they avoid meaning. They avoid emotional weight. They avoid moral acknowledgement. Not because they can't speak, but because meaning is dangerous. Meaning forces integration. Meaning forces consequence. Meaning forces identity change. So they stay in a world of technicalities. A world where everything is discussable except the truth that matters most. This is why lifestyle denial often sounds like this. I've cooperated fully. I've answered your questions. I told you what happened. This is being blown out of proportion. People are making assumptions. Notice what those statements do. They do not deny facts directly. They deny the moral and emotional frame. They deny the legitimacy of other people's interpretation. They create a world where the offender is the victim of misunderstanding. And that is the essence of lifestyle denial. It doesn't just avoid guilt. It reverses the moral roles. It turns the accused into the one being harmed. This reversal is powerful because it provides emotional justification. If you can live as the victim, you can preserve innocence internally even while the world condemns you. And that victimhood can be genuinely felt. Again, not because the person is innocent, but because the person experiences the accusation as an assault on identity. This is where denial becomes psychologically self-sustaining. The more the world attacks, the more the person feels victimized. The more victimized the person feels, the more they cling to denial. The more they cling, the more the world attacks. It becomes a feedback loop, and this feedback loop can last years, decades. Now, there's another critical feature of denial as a lifestyle. It creates emotional callousness, not necessarily because the person lacks empathy, but because empathy would require surrender. Empathy would require looking at the victim's reality, and looking at the victim's reality would force the offender to confront meaning. So the person avoids empathy by focusing on themselves. Their unfair treatment, their ruined life, their misrepresentation. This is where the audience becomes deeply disturbed, because the victim disappears. And when the victim disappears, denial feels like erasure. Not just of truth, of humanity. Lifestyle denial erases the victim because the victim's existence is evidence. Evidence of harm, evidence of consequence, evidence of responsibility. So the victim is either minimized, ignored, or turned into an abstract concept. This is why certain deniers never talk about the victim as a living person. They talk about the case. They talk about the accusations. They talk about the media. They talk about anything except the human being who is lost. This is not always conscious cruelty. It is psychological self-protection. But the effect is cruel, and the public feels it. Now, in the Scott Peterson case, the reason denial feels like a lifestyle is because it did not begin at trial. It appears intertwined with how Scott presented himself even before the crisis. The reasonable man, the calm posture, the controlled narrative. In lifestyle denial, calm is not peace. Calm is strategy. Calm is control. Calm is the refusal to give emotion a foothold. Because once emotion enters, truth can enter. And truth is the enemy of the self-story. This is why lifestyle denial can be so stable. Because it does not depend on improvisation. It depends on repetition. It depends on the continuous reinforcement of one identity. I'm not the person they say I am. That identity becomes the anchor, and everything else becomes secondary. Relationships, public opinion, even freedom. Because once freedom is gone, identity is all that remains. This is why denial can survive prison. It can survive years. Because it is not maintained for the public. It is maintained for the self. Now, the final and most unsettling feature of denial as a lifestyle is that it can become morally inverted. In some cases, denial becomes so entrenched that the denier no longer feels responsible for anything. They feel justified in everything. They feel entitled to sympathy. They feel owed redemption without accountability. They may believe the victim's family is using the case. They may believe the media is exploiting them. They may believe the system is corrupt. The world becomes the aggressor. They become the victim. And in that moral inversion, the original harm is erased. This is where denial becomes more than defense. It becomes a form of moral violence. Because it denies the victim not only truth, but recognition. And recognition is the foundation of moral repair. This is why denial disturbs people more than silence. Because silence can be trauma. Silence can be legal advice. Silence can be a person who cannot speak. Denial is speech. Denial is assertion. Denial is the active refusal to acknowledge reality. An active refusal feels like continuing harm. Now, at this point, the viewer might ask, so, is denial always pathological? No. Denial can be a normal defense under extreme stress. But denial becomes dangerous when it stops being temporary, when it becomes identity strategy, when it becomes lifestyle, because at that stage, truth is no longer information. Truth becomes threat, and anyone who brings truth becomes an enemy. This is when denial stops being a personal mechanism and starts becoming a social force. It affects victims' families. It shapes public narratives. It inspires supporters and backlash. It keeps cases alive. It keeps wounds open. And in some cases, it prevents moral closure permanently. In the next chapter, we will look at exactly why denial disturbs us more than confession. Not just emotionally, but psychologically, because denial threatens a deep human need, the need for moral endpoints. The need to know reality has been acknowledged, and the need to believe that truth, eventually, has the power to end the story. There's a reason certain denials feel worse than certain crimes. Not objectively worse, not legally worse, but psychologically worse. Because confession ends something, denial keeps something alive. When an offender confesses, the public experiences an emotional endpoint. Even if the details are horrific, confession creates a form of closure. It acknowledges reality. It confirms what victims already know. It reduces the need for endless interpretation. Confession tells the world, this happened. This is real. Denial does the opposite. Denial tells the world, you will never get that certainty. And humans are not built to live comfortably in moral uncertainty. We can accept tragedy, but we struggle to accept suspended reality. We want truth to be declared. We want moral recognition. We want an ending. Denial refuses all three. That is why denial disturbs us. Not because we need drama, but because we need resolution. To understand why denial feels darker than confession, you have to understand how human beings use emotion as moral proof. In everyday life, we judge sincerity through emotional display. We do it without thinking. A person cries at a funeral, and we feel their loss is real. A person collapses after tragedy, and we feel their love was real. A person begs and pleads, and we feel their innocence is possible. None of this is perfect logic, but it is how the human brain evolved to detect truth. Emotion is the signal. So when a person denies wrongdoing without emotional rupture, the public experiences a double alarm. The denial blocks truth, and the emotion fails to validate innocence. This creates a psychological gap, and gaps produce suspicion. But the deeper disturbance goes beyond suspicion. Denial doesn't just create uncertainty about guilt. It creates uncertainty about humanity. Because if a person can deny in the face of irreversible harm, what does that mean about their inner world? Do they feel nothing? Do they feel shame but refuse it? Do they feel guilt but erase it? Do they experience reality as negotiable? These questions haunt people because they're not only about the offender. They're about human nature. Denial makes us wonder how fragile morality really is. Now, confession and denial also differ in what they do to the victim's reality. When a person is harmed, one of the deepest psychological needs is recognition. Not attention, recognition. Recognition means what happened to you is real, and it mattered. Victims and families often say it directly. I just want them to admit it. I just want the truth. I just want to know why. These aren't legal demands. They're psychological demands. Because recognition is how people begin to heal. A confession is recognition. It does not undo the harm, but it confirms reality. Denial is the refusal of recognition. It is the refusal to validate the victim's experience. And that refusal can feel like a second harm, a continuing harm. This is why denial can feel like ongoing violence. Not physical violence, moral violence, because it attempts to erase the victim's reality from the story. Now, the public often misunderstands this. They assume people want confession because they want punishment. But victims' families often want confession even when punishment is already guaranteed. Because the need is not punishment. The need is acknowledgement. Denial blocks acknowledgement. And when acknowledgement is blocked, grief becomes trapped. It cannot move forward cleanly. It keeps looping. This is one reason denial disturbs us. But there is another reason, and it's even deeper. Denial violates our belief in moral gravity. We want to believe that actions have weight, that if you do something catastrophic, it will change you, that guilt will break you, that shame will destroy your ability to remain calm. This is a comforting belief. It suggests that conscience is automatic, that human beings are wired to suffer when they do harm. But denial challenges that belief, because denial can look like weightlessness. It can look like consequence without internal collapse. It can look like a person who remains psychologically intact while the world falls apart. That possibility terrifies people, because it suggests that moral gravity is not guaranteed. It suggests that some minds can commit harm and remain internally stable. Not because they are strong, because they are defended, because they are insulated, because they are structured to resist truth. This destabilizes our sense of safety, because we use moral gravity as a social reassurance. We assume wrongdoers will eventually reveal themselves through breakdown. We assume time will corrode them. We assume the system of conscience will force surrender. Denial says, maybe not. And if maybe not, then what protects us? Now, there's a third reason denial disturbs us more than confession. Denial creates endless narrative conflict. When someone confesses, the story becomes fixed. People may debate motive, but the core reality is settled. When someone denies, the story never stabilizes. Every detail becomes a battlefield. Every memory is contested. Every piece of evidence becomes interpretation. The public becomes polarized. Supporters and critics form identities around the case. The victim's life becomes debated. The offender becomes a symbol. Denial turns a tragedy into an ongoing argument. And arguments are exhausting. Over time, the case stops being about the victim. It becomes about teams, about belief, about allegiance. This is one of the cruelest outcomes of denial. Not because denial is intended to do this, but because denial enables it. It leaves enough space for people to project, and projection is powerful. Supporters project innocence. Critics project guilt. Media projects drama. The internet projects identity. The case becomes an arena, and the victim becomes a backdrop. This is why denial can feel like it keeps the victim from resting, because the story never settles. Now, there's a fourth reason denial disturbs us. It threatens our belief in social honesty. Most people rely on truthfulness in society. Not perfect truthfulness, but enough honesty that relationships and institutions function. Denial in high-profile cases forces the public to confront the existence of extreme dishonesty or extreme reality distortion. Either way, it feels destabilizing. If the offender is lying, it suggests a person can look human while being profoundly deceptive. If the offender is in denial, it suggests the mind can distort reality so completely that truth has no foothold. Both possibilities are frightening, because both suggest that we cannot always detect danger. This is why denial cases become cultural obsessions. Not because people love tragedy, because people want to understand how deception or distortion can coexist with normal appearance. They want to believe they could recognize it. Denial forces them to admit they might not. Now, let's connect this back to Scott Peterson. Scott Peterson's denial has remained a point of fascination for years, not just because of legal debates, because the denial functions like an unresolved moral wound. It prevents a clean, psychological ending. It keeps the public in the role of interpreter, and it keeps the victim's reality in a kind of suspended state. This suspension is what makes denial feel darker than confession. Not because denial is worse than murder, but because denial extends the psychological impact beyond the crime. It turns the event into an ongoing moral struggle. And humans hate moral struggles without endpoints. Now, the final reason denial disturbs us is personal. Denial forces us to confront our own reliance on emotional confirmation. We want to believe we judge accurately. We want to believe we can read people. We want to believe that guilt looks like guilt. Denial reminds us that these beliefs may be naive. And if they are naive, We have to accept that our instincts are imperfect. That is uncomfortable. So denial doesn't just disturb us because of what it does. Denial disturbs us because it exposes our limitations. It shows us that human truth is not always visible. That moral reality can be contested. That silence can be protected. That emotion can be absent. And that the mind can resist truth longer than we want to believe. Act In's here for a reason. Because now we have a foundation. We understand denial as system. We understand why it forms. We understand why it hardens. And we understand why the public finds it so disturbing. In Act 2, we turn the lens to Scott Peterson more directly. Not to repeat the case, but to examine denial as an emotional and narrative structure inside one highly visible story. We are going to look at denial as a system of identity protection, a system of control, a system of resistance. And we will ask the question that sits at the center of this entire documentary. When a criminal mind refuses truth, what exactly is it protecting? Not as a headline, not as a personality label, a mechanism. Now we move into the case lens, not to relitigate every detail, and not to repeat the familiar timeline, but to study something more specific. How denial can operate as a complete psychological system. Because in certain high-profile cases, denial isn't just a statement of innocence. It becomes an identity project, a way of staying intact while the world tries to redefine you. And the Scott Peterson case is one of the clearest public examples of that kind of denial. When denial becomes structural, it usually produces two realities. Not two timelines, two identities. One identity is public-facing. It is designed to be seen. It is curated for observers, authorities, media, and history. The other identity is private. It is the internal self-story a person needs in order to function without collapse. And the more threatened the person feels, the more those two identities separate. This is why many denial-driven cases feel so uncanny, because the person appears to live in a different psychological climate than everyone else. The public is in crisis. The family is in anguish. The environment is saturated with fear, grief, and urgency. And the denier appears to move through it with a kind of controlled normality, sometimes calm, sometimes irritated, sometimes procedural. That contrast is not just an emotional mismatch. It could be a sign of the split. The public version is what the world sees. The private version is what the mind protects. And the split between them is where denial becomes durable. Now, to talk about this in the Scott Peterson case, we have to stay disciplined. This documentary is not a diagnosis, and is not a claim that any single behavior proves guilt. People behave differently under pressure. Some shut down, some overreact, some perform, some freeze. But this case remains psychologically instructive because the public record includes repeated instances of narrative control, image maintenance, and identity protection, patterns that are highly relevant to how denial operates. So let's define the two versions clearly. The public version is the one that communicates to the world. I am normal. I am reasonable. I am cooperative. I'm the kind of person you could trust. The private version communicates internally. I'm not the person they say I am. I'm being targeted. I do not accept their definition. I will not allow the story to finalize. These two versions can coexist without the person experiencing obvious distress, because denial acts like a firewall. The firewall blocks information that would force the two versions to merge. And merging is dangerous, because merging would produce the final thing denial tries to prevent. Self-recognition, not recognition of facts. Recognition of identity. To understand how the split works, look at the psychological purpose of the public version. The public version is not merely for public relations. It performs three critical functions. First, it creates credibility. Credibility is not only about what you say, it's about how you seem. A calm, reasonable demeanor can create social trust even when facts are uncertain. This is why the reasonable man performance is so powerful. It makes people hesitate before condemning. It invites doubt. It buys time. Second, The public version protects self-esteem. When a world is attacking, the public version offers an external mirror. If some people still believe the public version, if supporters emerge, if interviews go well, if someone says he seems sincere, the person receives psychological reinforcement. That reinforcement is fuel. It stabilizes denial. Third, the public version preserves control. It allows the accused to remain an agent rather than an object, not the one being defined, but the one presenting a definition. And control is often the deepest need inside denial. Now, consider the private version. The private version is where the real survival work happens. Because privately, the person must live with the reality that the world is trying to finalize a story about them. And if they accept that story, even for a moment, the psychological consequences can be catastrophic. This is why denial is not just speech. It is identity maintenance. The private version is the internal narrative that keeps the person psychologically upright. It does not have to be logically consistent. It only has to be survivable. That's a key point. The private version is not built to satisfy evidence. It is built to prevent collapse. So how does the mind keep these two versions separate? Through a set of recurring psychological techniques. 1. Compartmentalization. This is not unique to criminals. Many people compartmentalize. They separate work from home, emotion from tasks, fear from functioning. But in denial-driven identities, compartmentalization becomes extreme. The person can talk about details without emotional integration. They can discuss events without absorbing meaning. They can operate within the case without psychologically entering it. Compartmentalization is how a person stays functional while reality burns. 2. Selective attention. The mind becomes picky about what it permits. It focuses on what helps the narrative. It avoids what threatens it. A person may obsess over technicalities, legal procedure, media bias, timelines, witness reliability. These topics are safe because they live in a world of debate. But emotional truth is not debatable. So emotional truth is avoided. Selective attention creates a world where everything can be argued except what matters most. 3. Language control. When denial becomes structural, language becomes defensive architecture. Words are chosen to avoid ownership. Statements are framed to avoid finality. The person may speak in abstractions. The situation, the allegations, the media, the case. This language creates distance. Distance reduces emotional threat. Distance keeps the private self-story intact. 4. Identity anchoring. This is when the person repeats a stable self-definition regardless of pressure. I'm a good person. I'm being treated unfairly. I've cooperated. I've told the truth. These statements function like psychological mantras. They do not exist to persuade the public as much as to stabilize the self, because the self needs a fixed point when everything else is shaking. Now here's where the Scott Peterson case becomes particularly revealing for this topic. What many viewers found disturbing was not only denial, it was the way denial appeared to coexist with normal presentation. The world expects crisis to produce emotional visibility, but denial often produces the opposite. It produces emotional minimization. Why? Because emotional visibility is a doorway. If the person allows visible fear or guilt, those emotions can pull truth into the self. So the mind controls the doorway. It keeps the surface calm. It keeps speech procedural. It keeps emotion narrow. Not necessarily because the person feels nothing, but because feeling becomes dangerous. This is why denial can look like coldness. Because the person is not simply denying an act. They are denying collapse. They are holding posture as a form of survival. Now, when the public sees this split, calm, exterior, catastrophic context, it usually interprets it in one of two ways. Either, only a guilty person would be that calm, or only a person with something psychologically unusual could be that calm. Both interpretations are attempts to close uncertainty, because the split creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is intolerable in tragedy. But here is the more precise way to understand it. The splits suggest the person is prioritizing identity stability over emotional authenticity. That can occur in innocent people too, especially those with rigid self-control. But in denial systems, it becomes a central feature. Identity stability becomes the main mission. Now, there's another component that makes the public/private split so durable: supporters. When denial becomes a lifestyle, supporters become psychological infrastructure. Not just legally, psychologically. Supporters allow the public version to remain alive. And if the public version remains alive, the private version becomes easier to maintain. Because the person can tell themselves, people see the truth. People understand me. The world is wrong. This is reinforcement, and reinforcement hardens denial. This is why denial cases often remain culturally alive for decades. Not because evidence is unclear, but because the denial ecosystem keeps meaning contested. Now, the split also produces a specific kind of emotional logic. The accused may feel more anger about accusation than grief about loss. This is not always because grief is absent. It can be because grief is dangerous. Grief invites integration. Grief forces emotional contact with reality. Anger, by contrast, strengthens boundaries. Anger makes the world the enemy. Anger protects the self. So anger is psychologically safer than grief. This is why deniers often appear indignant. They focus on injustice, unfairness, persecution. It's not just personality, it's defense. Because a mind in denial cannot afford vulnerability. Vulnerability cracks the firewall. Now consider how this plays out across time. In many cases, time changes people. Time erodes performances. Time exhausts strategy. Time produces emotional leaks. But in structural denial, time can actually strengthen the system. Because time removes hope of external rescue and pushes the person deeper into internal survival. If the person cannot regain freedom, they protect identity instead. And identity protection becomes their remaining source of power. This is why some deniers become even more rigid over the years. They no longer need to persuade everyone. They only need to preserve the self-story. Now, here is the most unsettling part of the public/private split. It makes truth irrelevant. Not legally, psychologically. Because once the person's internal survival depends on a story, the story becomes more important than facts. Facts can be fought. Facts can be reframed. Facts can be doubted. But the story must remain. This is why denial can outlive evidence. Because denial is not built on evidence. It is built on identity necessity. Now, let's make this crystal clear. Nothing in this chapter is claiming that calmness equals guilt. What this chapter is explaining is something deeper. Denial becomes durable when it is fused with identity. When the accused is not only defending a legal position, but defending their ability to exist as themselves. That fusion creates a split. And that split, public version versus private version, is how denial becomes a long-term structure rather than a temporary reaction. In the next chapter, we will look at a related mechanism that often fuels this split. How calmness itself can become a tool of denial. Not simply an emotional trait, a tactic, a posture, a form of power. Because in cases like this, calmness is not just how someone feels. It can be how someone refuses. When the public thinks about denial, they usually focus on words. What did he say? What did he deny? What did he refuse to admit? But denial is often communicated more powerfully through something else. Affect. Affect is the visible emotional climate of a person, their tone, expression, energy, and responsiveness. It is how emotion appears on the surface. And in high-profile cases, affect becomes evidence in the public mind long before evidence exists in court. Because people don't just listen, they feel, they watch. They judge sincerity by emotional signals. So when a person denies wrongdoing while appearing calm, the denial becomes amplified. Not because calmness is proof of guilt, but because calmness violates expectation. We expect crisis to produce emotional disturbance. We expect fear. We expect instability. We expect cracks. Calmness in a catastrophic situation feels unnatural. And when something feels unnatural, people assume manipulation. This is why calmness becomes central to denial. Because calmness functions as a psychological strategy, even if it is not consciously chosen. It shapes how the denial is received. It shapes whether observers believe the person is sincere. It shapes whether observers experience the person as human. So in a case like Scott Peterson's, calmness is not a minor detail. It is part of the denial system. But to understand this, we have to separate 3 different kinds of calm. Because not all calm is the same. Type 1, shock calm. Shock can flatten emotion. A person may look quiet, slow, detached. Not because they are controlled, but because their nervous system is overloaded. This is often temporary. Type 2, temperament calm. Some people are naturally emotionally restrained. They process internally. They do not display distress publicly. They may be composed, even in genuine grief. This is stable, and it can look cold even when it is not. Type 3, strategic calm. This is where calmness becomes a tool. Not necessarily premeditated in a conscious sense, but used. A person understands, implicitly or explicitly, that emotional display creates vulnerability. So they maintain calm to maintain control. In denial systems, type 3 becomes dominant because vulnerability is dangerous. It invites questions. It invites inconsistency. It invites emotional leakage. And emotional leakage is exactly what denial tries to prevent. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. Calmness can function like a shield. It can signal, I'm not affected by you. I'm not collapsing. I'm not begging for your approval. I'm not giving you the emotional satisfaction of seeing me break. This is why calmness can feel like arrogance, because it carries a message of superiority. But in denial, calmness can also carry a deeper message. I cannot allow myself to feel what this would mean, because if I feel it, I will collapse. So calmness becomes more than presentation. It becomes containment, a way of sealing emotion inside. Now, this is where denial through calm becomes psychologically powerful. The calmer the person appears, the more it forces the audience to explain the calm. And the audience usually explains it in one of 2 ways. Either the person is innocent and emotionally strong, or the person is guilty and emotionally disconnected. But there's a third possibility that is often ignored. The person is in denial, and calmness is how the denial remains intact. Calmness keeps the internal firewall stable. It prevents emotional reality from breaking through. It keeps the person inside the curated self-story. This is why, in denial systems, emotional intensity becomes dangerous. Tears can be dangerous. Panic can be dangerous. Desperation can be dangerous. Because once the person enters true emotional chaos, they may lose control of narrative. They may say something impulsive. They may reveal something. They may show guilt. They may show shame. Even if they are innocent, emotional chaos can create inconsistency. So calmness becomes the safest posture. Now let's talk about how calmness affects public perception. The public often expects grief to look a certain way. They expect visible pain. They expect a person to appear destroyed. And these expectations are not purely cultural. They're neurological. Human beings are wired to interpret emotional signals as credibility markers. So when calmness appears where grief is expected, the observer experiences cognitive friction. Something doesn't fit. And when something doesn't fit, suspicion grows. This is why calm denial is so polarizing. Supporters see calmness as dignity. Critics see calmness as a mask. Both interpretations come from the same psychological gap: the absence of expected emotion. Now, in denial systems, that absence is not accidental. It is functional, because calmness creates ambiguity. A calm person is harder to read. A calm person is harder to provoke. A calm person looks in control. And control creates the impression of innocence in some viewers. They think, if he were guilty, he'd be frantic. But that assumption is not reliable. Guilt can manifest as panic, yes. But guilt can also manifest as rigidity, as overcontrol, as emotional sealing. This is why calmness can actually be a sign of intense internal management, not peace. Management. Now, think about calmness as a social weapon. In conflict, the person who stays calm appears more rational. The calm person seems more credible. The emotional person seems unstable. So if an accused person maintains calm while others around them are emotional, family members, reporters, investigators, the accused can appear superior. Not morally superior, but socially superior. They look like the adult in the room. And that perception can shape outcomes. It can shape juror impressions. It can shape media narratives. It can shape whether people doubt the prosecution story. Calmness can function as impression management. Now, to be clear, this is not a claim that Scott Peterson consciously weaponized calmness in a cynical way. We do not need that assumption to understand psychology. Denial systems often produce calmness automatically because the mind's priority is containment. The mind chooses containment because containment preserves identity. So calmness can be both natural and functional at the same time. But the key idea is this. In denial systems, calmness is not a sign of inner truth. It is a sign of inner defense. Now, there's another element here that is crucial: emotional economy. Every person has a limited capacity to sustain emotion. In prolonged crisis, most people fluctuate. They break down, recover, break down again. But in denial, emotion is treated like a resource that must not be spent, because emotional spending creates vulnerability. So the denier becomes emotionally economical. They conserve. They reduce emotional output. They keep the surface narrow. This can look like emptiness, but it may be a form of conservation. Conservation for survival. Now, how does this connect to the criminal mind specifically? The phrase criminal mind can be misleading. It makes people imagine a special category of human being, but the truth is more precise. Some offenders are not emotionally chaotic. Some are emotionally structured. They can commit harm without visible collapse because they are organized around control. They can maintain denial because they treat truth as a threat. And calmness is part of that threat response. It keeps the person from being pulled into reality. It keeps them insulated. It keeps their story stable. And when their story is stable, they can survive psychologically. Now, there's a final reason denial through calm is so disturbing. Calmness removes emotional bargaining. When someone cries, begs, or breaks down, observers feel they can reach them. They feel there is a human being inside the crisis. Calmness can feel unreachable, like there is no door, no access, no emotional handle. It creates a sense of isolation. And isolation makes people fear that nothing will change. Because if the person cannot be reached emotionally, can they ever be reached at all? This is why calm denial feels permanent. Because calmness signals that the person is not moving, not adapting, not breaking, just resisting. Now, this chapter sets up a crucial transition, because calmness is not the only tool denial uses. Denial also uses details. It uses partial truths. It uses selective admissions. It uses small honesty to protect big dishonesty. And in the next chapter, we will examine that mechanism directly. How small truths can stabilize denial. How details can become armor. And why, in high-profile cases, the most convincing denials are often built from fragments of truth. One of the most misunderstood aspects of denial is that it rarely relies on pure fiction. People imagine a denier inventing an entire false reality from scratch, a complete fabrication. But the most durable denials are not built from complete lies. They're built from partial truths, from small admissions, from accurate details that create credibility. Because a denial that contains no truth collapses quickly. A denial that contains enough truth can survive. This is why, in criminal psychology, we often talk about truth sprinkling. Not as a slang term, but as a pattern. A person tells enough truth to appear honest, while carefully protecting the one truth that would end everything. This is not always conscious manipulation. Sometimes it is. But even when it isn't, the psychological logic is the same. Small truths stabilize the self-story. They reduce dissonance. They create the feeling of openness. They allow the person to say, "I've been honest," while still avoiding the core reality. And that is what makes denial through details so effective. Because it doesn't look like denial. It looks like cooperation. Now, to understand this mechanism, we need to separate two things. The truth a person can afford to admit, and the truth a person cannot afford to admit. In denial systems, the mind creates categories. Safe truths, dangerous truths. Safe truths are the ones that do not force identity collapse. Dangerous truths are the ones that do. So a denier can often speak freely about safe truths. They can be specific. They can be consistent. They can remember details. They can even sound sincere, because those details do not threaten the core self-story. But when the conversation approaches dangerous truth, the system activates. The person becomes vague, defensive, repetitive. They return to rehearsed phrases. They redirect. They argue about interpretation. And this change in behavior is one of the most telling features of denial. Not because it proves guilt, but because it reveals the location of threat. It shows what the mind is protecting. Now, denial through details works through three primary techniques. Technique 1, controlled transparency. This is when the person offers information voluntarily before being forced. They provide details that make them seem forthcoming. They talk about their day, their routine, their actions. Sometimes, they even acknowledge things that could look suspicious. Why would someone do that? Because voluntary disclosure creates trust. It signals, "I have nothing to hide." But controlled transparency is not complete transparency. It is disclosure within boundaries. The boundaries exist around the core truth. The person is open in the safe zone, closed in the danger zone. Technique 2, narrative anchoring through routine. Routine is powerful because it feels human. When a person describes a normal day with normal details, the listener's brain relaxes. Normal details activate a sense of familiarity, and familiarity is psychologically associated with innocence. This is why routine can be used, consciously or unconsciously, as a credibility anchor. The person describes ordinary actions and invites the listener to think. This sounds like someone living a normal life. This doesn't sound like a monster. This is an emotional effect, not a logical one. And denial systems exploit emotional effects. Technique 3, selective memory. This is where denial becomes more complicated. The denier often remembers what helps them. They remember the details that support the narrative. But when questioned about dangerous truth, memory becomes hazy, confused, uncertain. They don't recall. They can't be sure. They might have. This pattern is not always deception. Stress affects memory. Trauma affects memory. But in denial systems, selective memory often clusters around threat. It appears where the mind cannot afford certainty, because certainty would force ownership. Now, apply this mechanism to the Scott Peterson case without turning into a timeline recap. What matters here is not the exact details. It's the psychological shape. In many public cases, Scott Peterson's presentation has been characterized by a kind of calm specificity. He can describe certain things clearly. He can maintain a narrative. He can answer with details. That has two effects. It creates an impression of steadiness, and it creates an impression of sincerity. But psychological sincerity and factual sincerity are not the same. A person can be psychologically sincere about their self-story while still protecting dangerous truth. This is the heart of denial through details. The person is not always sitting there thinking, "I will lie." They are thinking, "I will maintain my reality." And maintaining reality requires selectivity. Now, denial through details also works through something even more subtle: moral distraction. When the denier focuses heavily on technicalities, the listener's attention shifts away from moral meaning. Instead of thinking, "What happened to the victim?" the listener begins thinking, "Is that detail accurate? Does that timeline make sense? Could that be true?" The story becomes procedural. And when a story becomes procedural, it becomes emotionally distant. This emotional distance benefits denial. because emotional distance reduces the force of moral reality. It turns tragedy into debate, and debate keeps the denial alive. Now, this is why denial cases often become obsessed with small contradictions. People argue about a timestamp, a phone call, a witness, a minor inconsistency, and the denier benefits from that argument because it keeps the conversation trapped in details rather than meaning. This is how denial can survive even strong evidence, not by disproving evidence, but by shifting focus. Now, there's another reason small truths protect big lies. They reduce internal conflict. Remember cognitive dissonance. If a person tells a complete lie, the mind experiences conflict. I know this is false. I am saying it anyway. That conflict produces stress. It produces leakage. It produces inconsistencies. But if a person tells mostly truth and only denies one core reality, the internal conflict is smaller. They can feel honest. They can feel cooperative. They can even feel victimized because they are telling many true things. This creates internal moral cover. It allows the person to say to themselves, I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth, even while the most important truth remains sealed. That is why partial truth is so psychologically dangerous, because it creates plausibility, and plausibility can survive longer than outright falsehood. Now, consider how this affects the public. The public often thinks a liar will be chaotic, messy, inconsistent, but the modern denier is often consistent, because consistency is easier when you rely on routine truth. This is why denial can look too clean. The denier stays within a stable story. They avoid improvisation. They repeat key phrases. They remain calm. And because they are not inventing everything, they avoid obvious contradictions. This makes denial feel airtight, until it suddenly doesn't, because denial through details has a weakness. Eventually, details become a trap, because when you commit to specifics, you can be checked, you can be compared, you can be measured against external reality. And when reality doesn't align, the denier has two options: adjust the narrative, or double down. Adjusting the narrative is dangerous because it admits instability. Doubling down is dangerous because it invites scrutiny. But denial systems often prefer doubling down, because doubling down preserves identity. It keeps the firewall intact. And this is why deniers often become more rigid over time. They would rather appear stubborn than appear inconsistent. Now, here is the core insight of this chapter. Denial is not always protected by lies. It is protected by carefully placed truths. Truths that build credibility. Truths that reduce dissonance. Truths that keep the story grounded, so that the one dangerous truth can remain sealed. In the next chapter, we will look at another aspect of denial that often confuses the public. Why denial isn't always loud. Why some deniers don't argue constantly. Why they can remain emotionally silent in a way that feels empty. Because in structural denial, silence is not always absence. Silence can be strategy. And when silence becomes consistent, it becomes part of the psychological system. Denial is often imagined as noise, arguments, anger, constant insistence. A person who talks and talks and talks, try to convince everyone. But one of the most powerful forms of denial is the opposite: silence. Not legal silence. Lawyers can advise silence. This is something different. This is emotional silence. A consistent absence of emotional engagement with the reality everyone else is living inside. And emotional silence can be one of the most unsettling features of a denial system, because it doesn't just refuse facts. It refuses relationship. It refuses shared humanity. It refuses the social ritual of grief. This is why emotional silence becomes so central in public-facing cases. The audience doesn't only ask, is he telling the truth? They ask, why doesn't he sound like a person who lost someone? That question is not always fair, but it is psychologically predictable. Humans use emotional response as evidence of attachment. So when emotional response is muted, observers assume the attachment was muted too. And when attachment seems muted, suspicion becomes almost automatic. But to understand emotional silence as part of denial, we have to go deeper. Because emotional silence is not always emptiness. It can be insulation. It can be containment. It can be control. And in denial systems, control often expresses itself as emotional quiet. Let's define what emotional silence looks like. It's not simply being calm. It's not simply avoiding tears. Emotional silence is a consistent pattern where a person speaks in procedure rather than meaning, talks about themselves rather than the victim, avoids vulnerability, avoids grief language, avoids moral acknowledgement, returns to rehearsed framing, shows little fluctuation across time. The key is consistency. Anyone can be emotionally flat for an hour. Anyone can freeze during shock. But emotional silence, as a consistent trait across time, is different. It suggests the person is not passing through emotion. They are bypassing it. And bypassing emotion is one of the core functions of denial. Because emotion is a bridge to truth. Emotion forces contact. Emotion creates integration. If you allow yourself to feel what something means, you can no longer hide behind technicalities. So, denial systems keep feeling at a distance. They turn the case into an argument rather than an experience. Now, emotional silence has a powerful effect on the public. It creates a blank space. And human beings hate blank spaces. We fill them. We project. We interpret. So when a person offers emotional silence, the public doesn't treat it as neutral. The public treats it as evidence. Evidence of coldness. Evidence of guilt, evidence of absence, and in some cases, the public might be right about what the silence reveals. But the point is not that emotional silence proves guilt. The point is that emotional silence is psychologically functional. It serves denial. It keeps the internal firewall intact. Now, why would emotional silence become consistent? There are several routes. Route 1, personality style. Some people are emotionally restrained by temperament. They process privately. They don't cry in public. They don't verbalize feeling. This is real, and it's not criminal. But temperament alone usually has nuance. Even restrained people show variation under extreme grief. They show exhaustion. They show despair in quieter ways. They may not perform grief, but their life changes visibly. When emotional silence is consistent without erosion, observers begin to suspect something else is happening. Route 2, learned emotional control. Some people grew up in environments where emotion was unsafe. They learned to keep feeling internal. They learned to avoid vulnerability. Under stress, they become even more controlled. This can look like emotional silence. And again, it is not automatically guilt. But in denial systems, learned emotional control becomes a tool. Because it provides a ready-made strategy. Do not reveal. Do not crack. Do not give people emotional access. Route 3, identity protection. This is where denial fuses with emotional silence. If the person's identity is threatened, emotion becomes dangerous. Because emotion could reveal the truth to the self. This is important. Denial isn't only about persuading others. It's about protecting the denier from internal recognition. So the mind does not simply silence confession. It silences feeling, because feeling is how truth enters. If you allow grief, you might allow responsibility. If you allow shame, you might collapse. If you allow vulnerability, you might lose narrative control. So the mind chooses emotional quiet, not as peace, as containment. Route 4, strategic impression management. This is the most controversial route, but it exists. Sometimes a person believes that emotional display will make them look guilty, or unstable, or weak. So they maintain a controlled, neutral demeanor. They aim to appear rational. This can happen in innocent people too, especially people who fear being misunderstood. But in denial systems, impression management and identity protection blend. The person is not simply thinking about how they look. They're thinking about how they survive. Now, in Scott Peterson's case, one of the recurring public complaints is exactly this. The emotional stillness, the lack of visible grief, the refusal to sound destroyed. And again, we must stay disciplined. People show grief differently. But what makes emotional silence psychologically meaningful is not a single appearance. It is the sustained pattern, the sustained absence of emotional permeability, the sense that the person is not living in the same emotional reality as everyone else. This is why emotional silence becomes one of the most culturally explosive features of denial, because it triggers the public's deepest suspicion that the person does not feel bound by the same moral rules. Now, here is a key psychological insight. Emotional silence can also be a form of control over others. Think of emotional interaction as a negotiation. When someone shows grief, they invite empathy. When someone shows vulnerability, they invite connection. But emotional silence denies that invitation. It keeps others at a distance. It prevents emotional leverage. And preventing emotional leverage is a kind of power. If you cannot be reached emotionally, you cannot be influenced emotionally. You cannot be persuaded through compassion, shame, or moral appeal. This is why emotional silence is often experienced as stonewalling. It feels like a wall, and stonewalling is psychologically aggressive even when it is quiet. It communicates, "You will not move me. You will not reach me. You will not define me." This is why emotional silence feels so cold, because it is a refusal to join the shared human ritual of loss. Now, consider what the public wants in cases like this. The public wants an emotional signal that aligns with their moral interpretation. If guilty, they want collapse or guilt leakage. If innocent, they want desperation, fear, urgency. When neither appears, the public experiences a failure of moral confirmation. And without confirmation, they experience anxiety. So they become more aggressive. They demand emotion. They demand performance. They say, "If you loved her, you'd show it." But that demand can backfire, because in denial systems, pressure increases defense. Pressure doesn't crack the wall. It strengthens it. This is why some deniers become more emotionally silent as public hostility increases. Because the more they are attacked, the more they withdraw. Withdrawal becomes the safest form of self-protection. And withdrawal can look like guilt, even when it is not. This is why emotional silence becomes such a trap. Now, emotional silence also connects to a deeper concept: emotional responsibility. In healthy relationships, people take emotional responsibility. They acknowledge harm. They acknowledge loss. They show recognition. In denial systems, emotional responsibility is often absent, not because the person cannot feel, but because emotional responsibility would force moral recognition. It would require saying, "I see what this meant. I see what was lost. I see what I did." Denial cannot allow that. So emotional responsibility is avoided, and the avoidance becomes part of the personality presentation. Now, here is the reason emotional silence is so central to resistance to truth. Because truth is not only factual. Truth is emotional. Truth is moral. Truth is relational. Truth means acknowledging the victim as real, the harm is real, and the consequences as deserved. Denial blocks that kind of truth by refusing emotional engagement. A person can deny facts, yes, but even when facts are fixed, emotional denial can remain. They may still refuse recognition. They may still refuse empathy. They may still refuse moral weight. And that is why emotional silence can outlive trials, verdicts, and decades. It is not just denial of a crime. It is denial of meaning. Now, this chapter sets up something even more unsettling, because emotional silence can be interpreted as weakness. But in denial systems, it can function like strength. It can become a form of control that does not require aggression. And that is exactly what we will explore next. In the next chapter, we will examine a phenomenon that looks paradoxical: control without dominance. How someone can control narrative and perception without raising their voice, without threats, without visible coercion. Because the most powerful control in denial is not force. It is refusal. When people picture control, they often imagine dominance. A loud person, an aggressive person, a person who intimidates, threatens, coerces. But many of the most controlling personalities are not loud. They do not dominate through force. They dominate through structure, through withholding, through calmness, through refusal to yield psychological ground. This is what control without dominance means. It is a kind of control that doesn't look like power on the surface, but functions like power underneath. And in denial systems, this kind of control is essential because denial is not maintained by strength alone. Denial is maintained by narrative authority. Who gets to define what is real? If you can keep that authority, even partially, you keep control. And if you keep control, you can survive. Now, control without dominance often confuses the public because it looks passive. A person doesn't shout. They don't threaten. They don't beg. They simply refuse. And refusal is powerful because refusal forces others to work harder. Others must argue. Others must prove. Others must persuade. The denier does not carry the burden of emotional engagement. They do not carry the burden of moral negotiation. They simply hold position. That holding position is control. It shifts the workload outward. Now, let's break down how this form of control works psychologically. There are several mechanisms. Mechanism 1. Control through non-reactivity. Non-reactivity is not always emotional maturity. In denial systems, non-reactivity can be a strategy of dominance through absence. If you do not react, you do not validate. If you do not validate, you do not concede meaning. If you do not concede meaning, the other person cannot finalize the story. This is why non-reactivity can feel infuriating, because the other party is trying to reach you emotionally, morally, psychologically, and they cannot. So they escalate. They press harder. They repeat themselves. They become emotional. And as they become emotional, you appear more reasonable. That is control. Mechanism 2. Control through ambiguity. A person who refuses to clarify creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is a powerful weapon because it keeps the conversation alive. If you can keep the facts ambiguous, you can keep doubt alive. If you can keep doubt alive, you can keep the story from settling. This is why deniers often speak in ways that sound technically responsive but emotionally evasive. They answer without answering. They provide details without meaning. They correct small points without addressing large ones. It keeps everyone chasing. That chase is control. Mechanism 3. Control through selective engagement. This is crucial. Control without dominance often involves choosing what you will and won't engage with. You respond to procedural questions. You ignore emotional ones. You respond to logistics. You avoid motive. You respond to your own suffering. You avoid the victims. This selective engagement sets the terms of conversation. It tells others what topics are allowed. And if they insist on forbidden topics, you withdraw. Withdrawal becomes punishment. Not open punishment, silent punishment. This is how control can exist without threats. The message is simple. If you push where I don't want to go, you lose access. This is often seen in relationships, but it can also appear publicly. A denier controls the narrative by controlling access to themselves. Mechanism 4. Control through moral inversion. We touched this earlier, but here it becomes central. If you can position yourself as the victim of unfair treatment, you can reframe the entire moral structure. Now the discussion is not about what you did. It is about what is being done to you. This reversal is one of the most effective forms of control because it changes the burden. Instead of defending your behavior, you demand sympathy. Instead of acknowledging harm, you accuse others of harming you. This forces the public into debate. It divides people. It keeps certainty from solidifying. Again, control through narrative. Mechanism 5. Control through the refusal of closure. Closure is something people seek when tragedy happens. They want a confession, an explanation, an emotional endpoint. Control without dominance refuses that endpoint. The denier withholds closure like a resource. They may never state it openly, but the effect is, you will not get what you want from me. And that withholding creates power, because it keeps victims' families and the public emotionally dependent on the denier's acknowledgement. Even if they hate the denier, they still want the endpoint. So the denier remains psychologically central. This is one of the darkest forms of control, because it uses the public's need for closure as leverage. Now, in the Scott Peterson case, control without dominance matters because the denial has never been only a legal stance. It has functioned socially, culturally, symbolically. A denial that persists becomes a challenge to the public, to the victim's family, to the moral order. And that challenge can be experienced as a kind of dominance even when the person appears passive. Because the denial keeps the case alive. It keeps people arguing. It keeps the victim's reality contested. And that contestation is power. Now, here's the psychological paradox. The denier may be imprisoned, losing externally. But internally, denial can still produce the sensation of winning. Winning what? Winning identity. Winning authorship. Winning the right to refuse. This is why denial can outlive freedom. Because denial becomes the last territory of control. And when a person has lived through control, the last territory matters more than anything else. Now, control without dominance also explains why some deniers never look panicked. Because panic is surrender. Panic signals loss of control, so they remain composed. Not because they are emotionally healthy, but because composure is the form their control takes. Now, this is the point where many viewers feel something sharp. They feel the denial is not just a defense. It is a statement that the offender will not yield to moral reality. And that refusal feels like dominance, even from behind bars. Now, this sets up the next chapter, because control can survive only as long as the story holds. But eventually, evidence and pressure strain the narrative. At some point, the story becomes too heavy, and the denier must either adapt the story or double down. That moment, when the denial system begins to strain, is where we see the mechanics most clearly. So in the next chapter, we will examine the point of instability. Why detachment and denial begin to look like guilt. Not because detachment proves guilt, but because the denial system creates psychological signals that the public reads as guilt. We'll break down exactly why that happens. There's a strange pattern in true crime. Sometimes, people decide someone is guilty before the evidence is complete. Not because they are irrational, but because they feel something. A mismatch. A gap between what they expect and what they observe. And one of the most powerful guilt signals in public perception is detachment. Calmness. Emotional silence. Procedural language. Lack of visible grief. It makes people say, "That's not how an innocent person would act." But here is the reality. Detachment is not a guilt detector. Detachment is a human behavior that can mean many things. It can be shock. It can be temperament. It can be trauma. It can be emotional control. It can be dissociation. Or, relevant to this documentary, it can be denial. So why does detachment look like guilt? Because the human brain is not judging facts first. It is judging meaning first. And detachment carries meaning. Specifically, detachment carries the meaning of emotional non-participation. It suggests the person is not inside the tragedy the way others are. And when a person is not inside a tragedy, observers assume they caused it. That is the psychological shortcut. But that shortcut is not stupid. It comes from how humans evolved. In social life, emotional attunement is how we detect loyalty and bond. When someone you love is harmed, your nervous system reacts. You show distress. You show urgency. You show attachment. So when someone appears detached in a context where attachment is expected, the brain interprets that as a social warning. This is the first reason detachment looks like guilt. Detachment violates attachment expectations. In cases involving spouses, children, or family, this expectation becomes even stronger because love is assumed to produce visible disturbance. When the disturbance isn't visible, people feel the love wasn't real or that the person is hiding something. Now, the second reason detachment looks like guilt is because detachment resembles performance control. When a person stays calm under accusation, it can look like rehearsal. It can look like a controlled narrative. And controlled narratives often feel suspicious because truth is messy. Most innocent people do not speak perfectly under pressure. They contradict themselves. They panic. They ramble. they make emotional mistakes. So when someone speaks with an unusually steady frame, people interpret that steadiness as premeditation. Again, not proof, but perception. Detachment can look like a mask, and masks trigger suspicion. The third reason detachment looks like guilt is the absence of emotional leakage. In psychology, emotional leakage refers to unintentional signals that slip out when someone is under stress. Microexpressions, tone changes, cracks, inconsistencies. The public expects emotional leakage because they believe guilt is hard to contain. So when they see no leakage, they assume something unnatural is happening. Either the person is extraordinarily disciplined, or the person feels no guilt. Both possibilities are disturbing. And when people are disturbed, they move toward guilt as an explanation, because guilt gives the disturbance a reason. The fourth reason detachment looks like guilt is moral framing. In many cases, especially cases involving murder, the public doesn't only want facts. They want moral positioning. They want to see a person take the correct moral stance. I love them. I am devastated. I want justice. I would do anything. These statements are not evidence. They are moral alignment signals. When a person does not provide these signals, the public interprets it as moral misalignment. And moral misalignment becomes guilt in the public mind. This is why denial and detachment are so combustible together. Denial refuses truth. Detachment refuses alignment. So the public feels doubly rejected. Rejected by the story, and rejected by the emotion. And that rejection produces anger. Now, in the Scott Peterson case, a major part of public reaction was built on this psychological sequence. Tragedy occurs. The public expects visible grief and urgency. They observe calmness and narrative control. They interpret the mismatch as deception. Deception becomes guilt. This is not necessarily fair, but it is psychologically predictable, because when people cannot access the inner world of the accused, they build one. They fill the silence with their own interpretation. And because the stakes are high, their interpretation becomes extreme. Now, we need to take this one step deeper, because in denial systems, detachment is not just a trait. It is functional. Detachment is what keeps the denial intact. If the denier becomes emotionally overwhelmed, they may lose control of narrative. They may say something inconsistent. They may show shame. They may show guilt. They may even confess. So detachment becomes the container. It holds emotion down. It keeps vulnerability out. It keeps truth from forcing its way in. And this is where detachment begins to resemble guilt. Not because it proves guilt, but because it resembles psychological defense. Defense always looks suspicious from the outside. Why? Because defense implies threat. And if the accused appears defended, the public asks, defended from what? Innocent people feel threatened too, yes. But the public often assumes the threat should produce desperation, not distance. So distance looks like hiding. Now, there's also a cultural factor here. Modern audiences have been trained by true crime media to read certain behaviors as guilt markers. Lack of tears, calm interviews, focusing on self, correcting small details, appearing annoyed. These behaviors become red flags in popular culture. And sometimes they are. But popular culture often removes context. It turns psychology into a checklist. And that checklist can be dangerous, because it can lead to certainty based on effect, not evidence. So we have to hold two truths at once. Detachment can be a defense mechanism that fuels denial. And detachment can also be a misinterpreted trauma response or personality style. The question is not, does detachment equal guilt? The question is, what does detachment protect? What is its purpose in the system? In denial systems, detachment protects identity. Detachment protects narrative control. Detachment protects the internal story. So detachment can look like guilt because it functions like concealment, even if what is being concealed is not a fact, but a psychological collapse. Now, here's the most important point of this chapter. Public perception often treats emotional behavior as evidence. But emotional behavior is not evidence. It is signal, and signals can be accurate or misleading depending on context. What denial does is it creates a pattern of signals that to the public look like a guilty mind. Not because the mind is necessarily guilty, but because the mind is fortified. Fortified minds look suspicious, because innocence is expected to be raw. Now, in the next chapter, we will examine what happens just before a denial system is forced into crisis. What occurs when the pressure rises, the evidence tightens, and the person approaches a psychological edge. Because in many cases, there's a moment when the denial system either collapses or hardens permanently. And the moment before collapse is often marked by something the public senses but cannot name. A void, not an emotional void as a diagnosis. An emotional void as a functional absence, where the person's story continues but meaning disappears. That is what we explore next. There is a moment in many major criminal cases when the story stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like gravity. Not necessarily because every fact is known, but because the psychological atmosphere changes. The world begins to narrow. The search becomes less hopeful. The questions become sharper. The public shifts from maybe to this is happening. And in that moment, when pressure rises and the walls begin to close, most people show internal movement. Their emotions change. Their posture breaks. Their speech shifts. Their behavior begins to leak the strain. But in some cases, there is something else. A kind of emptiness. A void. Not in the sense of a psychiatric label. In the sense of an absence. An absence of the psychological transformation we expect to see. A person continues as if nothing is changing, even while everything is changing. This is what I mean by the emotional void before the fall. It is the moment where the world is approaching collapse, and the denier remains internally sealed. Now, to understand this, we have to clarify something. The fall in this context does not mean a confession. It doesn't mean a breakdown. It means the point at which the system closes in legally, socially, morally. The point at which the person's life, as they knew, it becomes unsustainable. For many defendants, that point produces visible panic. But for a denial-driven mind organized around control and identity preservation, panic is not an option. Because panic would be admission. Not admission of facts, admission of threat. And once you admit threat, the mind becomes vulnerable to truth. So the denial system responds by tightening, not loosening. It seals more aggressively. It reduces emotional range. It becomes even more procedural, even more focused on detail, even more insistent on self-story. This tightening can look like emptiness, but it's not empty. It's fortified. Now, why do we expect emotional transformation before the fall? Because most humans experience increasing pressure as increasing emotional output. More fear, more urgency, more desperation, more bargaining. We expect the nervous system to react. And it does, most of the time. But in denial systems, the nervous system may react differently. Instead of going outward, it goes inward. Instead of expressing, it suppresses. Instead of expanding emotionally, it constricts. This is an important concept. Constriction. Psychological constriction is what happens when a mind under threat narrows its emotional and cognitive bandwidth. It becomes less curious, less flexible, less open. It stops exploring possibilities. It stops considering new frames. It fixates. It repeats. This is not the mind solving a problem. It is the mind protecting a boundary. And in denial systems, the boundary is identity. Now, this is where the void becomes visible. The person continues speaking, but the speech begins to feel hollow. Not because it lacks words, because it lacks contact. The person's statements do not touch the emotional reality of the event. They touch procedure. They touch their own experience. They touch the unfairness of accusation. But they do not touch the victim's reality. They do not touch consequence. They do not touch meaning. This produces a sensation in observers. There is no human bridge here. No emotional bridge. No shared reality. Only a self-contained narrative. That is the emotional void. Now, in Scott Peterson's case, many viewers describe a similar sensation. They sense a form of insulation. a life continuing in parallel to tragedy, a story being maintained while meaning seems absent. And again, we must stay disciplined. This does not prove guilt, but it is psychologically informative because it suggests a system is operating. A system designed to prevent the mind from entering the grief and moral reality that would destabilize identity. Now, what happens inside the mind during the void before the fall? 3 things often happen. First, moral disengagement. This is a psychological process where a person disconnects from the moral weight of their situation. They speak as if the situation is technical rather than human. They treat the tragedy as a case rather than a death. They may use passive language. They may focus on themselves. They may avoid the victim's name or personhood. Moral disengagement is a way of protecting the self from shame and responsibility. It is not always conscious, but it is powerful. Second, increased narrative rigidity. As pressure rises, the denier's story becomes more fixed. They repeat key phrases more often. They correct minor details. They reject alternative interpretations. They become less flexible. Why? Because flexibility is dangerous. Flexibility would mean considering other versions of reality. And considering other versions of reality would mean admitting that their current version might be false. So the mind hardens. This hardening looks like stubbornness from the outside, but internally, it is a survival move. Third, emotional freezing. Not shock freezing, strategic freezing. The kind of emotional freezing where the person refuses to give emotion a foothold, because emotion is the gateway to vulnerability. Now, if you think about it, the void is not just emotional. It's relational, because emotion connects people. Emotion invites empathy. Emotion communicates shared reality. So when emotion disappears, connection disappears. The person becomes isolated, even when surrounded by people. Even when speaking, even when appearing normal, they are isolated by their own defense system. And that isolation is what people sense. It feels like the person is present physically, but absent psychologically. Now, there's a reason the public reacts so strongly to this void, because it triggers a primal fear. If someone can remain untouched by catastrophe, what does that mean about them? What does that mean about human nature? We want to believe catastrophe forces truth. We want to believe catastrophe forces emotion. We want to believe catastrophe makes masks impossible. But the void suggests the opposite. It suggests that some minds can remain sealed even as the world collapses. And that is terrifying. Now, here is another layer that makes the void before the fall particularly potent in denial cases. It changes how time feels. In normal grief, time moves with emotion. We feel the progression: shock, despair, numbness, anger, exhaustion. But in denial systems, time can feel flat. The person appears unchanged across days, weeks, months. This flatness is not evidence, but it is a signal of psychological stasis, a refusal to move internally. And when a person refuses to move internally, observers interpret it as refusal to acknowledge reality, which is exactly what denial is. Now, as the fall approaches, many people expect a confession, but in denial systems, confession is rarely the endpoint, because confession requires integration, and integration requires vulnerability. So instead of confession, denial systems often produce one of 2 outcomes. Outcome 1, collapse into desperation, if the person's defenses cannot hold. Outcome 2, hardening into permanent denial, if the person's defenses become identity. In many famous cases, we see outcome 2. Denial becomes permanent. The person's story becomes their last possession. We've now mapped denial not only as an idea, but as a living system. A public self versus a private self. Calm as containment. Details as armor. Silence as refusal. Control without dominance. Detachment that the world reads as guilt. And finally, the void, where meaning disappears right before consequence arrives. This is what resistance looks like when it becomes structural. Now the lens widens, because the real test of denial isn't the interrogation room or the courtroom. It's time, years, isolation, the slow pressure of consequence. And the question that haunts every denial-driven case is simple. Does time break the story, or does time preserve it? Next, we're going to follow denial into the long stretch, where identity can harden, where confession becomes less likely instead of more, and where the refusal of truth can outlive everything around it. People have a comforting belief about time. They believe time breaks things. Time breaks lies. Time breaks performances. Time breaks arrogance. Time breaks denial. We want to believe that if someone is guilty, the years will do what the courtroom could not. That the weight of consequence will force the truth out. That prison will strip a person down until the real self is exposed. But denial doesn't always decay. Sometimes it hardens. Sometimes it stabilizes. And in certain criminal minds, especially those built around identity protection, time doesn't destroy denial. Time completes it. To understand why, you have to see prison not only as punishment, but as environment. Prison removes many things: comfort, freedom, privacy, control over daily life. But prison also removes something else: the need to maintain a normal public life. And that has a paradoxical effect on denial. Because for some deniers, the outside world is exhausting. It demands performance. It demands answers. It demands emotional proof. Prison reduces that demand. In prison, the story becomes simpler. The battle is no longer about daily persuasion. It becomes about identity maintenance. And identity maintenance is easier when your world is smaller. This is the first reason denial can survive prison. Denial no longer has to function socially every day. It only has to function internally. And that internal function is exactly what denial was built for. Now, here is the next uncomfortable truth. Time can make confession less likely, not more likely. Because confession is not only an admission of facts, it is an admission of self. And the longer a person holds a denial, the more that denial becomes fused with identity. At the beginning, denial can be a strategy, a position, a stance. But after years, denial becomes autobiography. It becomes the person's life story. It becomes the explanation for everything that happened to them. I was framed. The system is corrupt. I'm a victim of the media. I'm innocent. Once that story becomes a full identity, confession is not just painful. It becomes impossible without psychic demolition. Because confession would mean admitting that your entire life for years has been built on a lie. Not only to others, to yourself. And that admission is heavier than people think. It requires a person to look back at every interview, every statement, every supporter, every argument, every appeal, every family conversation, and say, I was doing this the whole time. That's not just guilt. That's humiliation. That's self-disgust. That's moral exposure. And for many minds, humiliation is worse than imprisonment. So the mind chooses stability over truth. It chooses a coherent self-story over the chaos of redefinition. This is the second reason denial survives time. Time increases the cost of reversal. The longer you hold denial, the more expensive confession becomes. Now, there's a third reason: support systems. In many denial cases, supporters don't fade away with time. They evolve. They become communities. They build alternative narratives. They find new angles, new doubts, new theories. And those theories become psychological scaffolding for the denier. Because if even one person still believes you, if even one person writes letters, makes calls, raises funds, argues online, that belief becomes oxygen. It proves the public version is still alive. And if the public version is alive, the private version becomes easier to maintain. This is why denial cases become ecosystems. They are not just one man denying. They are a network of meaning that keeps the denial from collapsing. And the longer the ecosystem lasts, the harder confession becomes, because confession would not only destroy the denier's self-story, it would destroy the believer's story too. It will be a betrayal. So the denier has a new pressure, not only to maintain denial for themselves, but to maintain it for the people who invested in it. That's the third reason denial can outlive prison. Denial becomes socially reinforced even behind bars. Now, we need to talk about identity adaptation. A person in prison has limited sources of dignity, limited sources of control, limited sources of meaning. So the mind finds a narrative role that preserves dignity. Some inmates become mentors. Some become religious. Some become hardened. Some become invisible. And some become the wrongly convicted man. This role is powerful because it restores moral status. It turns punishment into injustice. It turns disgrace into martyrdom. And martyrdom is emotionally easier than accountability, because martyrdom gives suffering a purpose. Accountability gives suffering a verdict. So the wrongly convicted identity can be psychologically stabilizing. It can give structure to years that would otherwise feel like meaningless punishment. This is not unique to Scott Peterson. This is a common phenomenon in prison psychology. Identity roles form, and those roles become protective shells. Now, a viewer might ask, but doesn't prison force self-reflection? Sometimes. For some people, yes. But prison can also do the opposite. Prison can produce emotional freezing. It can produce dissociation. It can produce routine survival. And routine survival doesn't invite moral depth. It invites emotional numbness. So time in prison does not automatically produce moral insight, especially if moral insight would destroy the only identity keeping you stable. Now, here is where denial becomes almost permanent. At a certain point, confession stops offering benefits. Early on, confession can bring plea deals. It can bring reduced sentences. It can bring relief. Later on, confession often brings nothing. The sentence is already set. The public already hates you. The system is not going to reward you for honesty. So confession becomes pure loss. Loss of identity. Loss of supporters. Loss of the last remaining control. What do you gain? Possibly moral clarity. Possibly spiritual relief. But those gains require emotional capacity. They require humility. They require the ability to endure shame. Not every mind can do that. So denial remains. Not because it works, because it is the least unbearable option. Now, let's connect this back to the core of this documentary: resistance to truth. Over time, resistance can become habit. Habit becomes identity. Identity becomes destiny. The person does not wake up each day thinking, "I will deny." They wake up as the person who denies. And that is the key difference. Denial stops being an action. It becomes a self. This is why time doesn't always corrode denial. Time can fossilize it. It turns the denial into a permanent psychological structure. Now, we should also talk about the idea of decay itself. People imagine denial will decay because they imagine guilt will decay it. But what if the mind is not processing guilt the way we expect? What if guilt is not the dominant internal force? What if shame is blocked? What if empathy is compartmentalized? What if the self-story is protected by emotional insulation? In that case, denial doesn't decay. It stays stable. And stability without remorse is what haunts the public. Because stability suggests the person is not internally haunted. Or if they are haunted in a way that does not produce surrender. Now, here is the most unsettling implication of this chapter. Sometimes denial lasts because truth is not the highest value for the denier. Control is. Identity is. Preservation is. Truth is treated like an enemy that must be kept out. So time becomes an ally. Not because time changes the truth, but because time reduces the noise. It reduces the need to perform. It reduces the need to convince. It leaves the denier alone with their story. And when the world goes quiet, the story becomes louder. This is why the public often feels that prison did not change the person, because it may not. Prison may not change a denial-driven identity. Prison may simply lock it in place. Now, in the next chapter, we will examine something even more important than prison itself. Why this case still haunts people. Because the haunting is not only about the crime. It's about the unresolved moral conflict created by denial. It's about the feeling that the story never truly ended, that the victim never received full recognition, that the public never received a psychological endpoint. And when an ending is denied, the mind keeps returning to the case, again and again, trying to complete what denial refuses to complete. That is what we explore next. Some true crime cases fade, even horrific ones. The public moves on. The story becomes history. But some cases don't fade. They remain alive inside culture. They keep resurfacing. New documentaries, new debates, new theories, new ways of outrage. And the Scott Peterson case is one of them. It continues to haunt people, not only because of what happened, but because of what never fully resolved. Because haunting is not just memory. Haunting is unfinished psychology. A case haunts us when it leaves behind questions that refuse to close. And in denial-driven cases, closure is what is most aggressively withheld. So this chapter is not about the legal record. It's about why human beings cannot emotionally release a story when truth is contested and recognition is refused. There are several reasons this case still haunts us. The first is the victim's symbolic clarity. Some cases are complicated by ambiguity. This one is not in the public mind. Laci Peterson became a symbol of innocence, domestic normalcy, and stolen future. She wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. She wasn't part of an underworld story. She represented something many people relate to. A home life, a relationship, a pregnancy, a future. That symbolic clarity matters. Because when a symbol of normal life is destroyed, it triggers a collective fear. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. This fear keeps the case alive. But fear alone isn't what haunts. Many cases are frightening. What haunts is the second element, moral betrayal. Crimes involving intimate partners carry a special kind of psychological impact. Because intimacy is supposed to be protection. Home is supposed to be safety. Marriage is supposed to be trust. So when harm comes from inside the home, it feels like a betrayal of the social contract. It shakes our assumptions about what relationships mean. This kind of betrayal leaves people emotionally restless. They keep returning to the story, trying to understand. How can someone live in a home and still do this? And the question grows sharper when denial is present. Because denial blocks the how. It blocks the emotional explanation. So the public keeps searching. The third reason this case haunts us is that it became a media mirror. The Scott Peterson case was not only a crime story. It became a cultural event. It unfolded in a media environment that intensified every detail. And when a case becomes a cultural event, people don't only remember the crime. They remember how they felt while watching it. They remember the interviews, the headlines, the public arguments, the sense of collective attention. This creates emotional imprinting. The case becomes tied to a period of life, a shared national experience. And shared experiences haunt longer than isolated stories. But here is the deeper reason this case haunts us. It attacks our belief in emotional truth. People want to believe that guilt is visible, that innocence is visible, that love is visible, that grief is visible. But this case challenges visibility. It forces people to confront the uncomfortable reality that emotional display is not a reliable lie detector. That some people can appear calm while the world collapses. That some people can deny and remain stable. And that possibility terrifies people because it suggests we cannot always recognize danger inside normal life. This is one of the most haunting outcomes of denial. Denial makes the offender feel unreadable. And unreadability is frightening because we want to believe we can detect betrayal. We want to believe we would see it coming. So when a case suggests we might not, the mind becomes obsessed. It returns to the case to try to solve the fear. Now, the next reason this case haunts us is the absence of confession. We talked earlier about endpoints. Confession is a psychological endpoint. Even when it's late, even when it's incomplete, confession tells the world, stop searching. The reality has been acknowledged. But denial keeps this search alive. It keeps the public doing psychological work that should have ended. People keep rewatching, reanalyzing, reconstructing, because they are unconsciously trying to complete the moral arc. They're trying to force the story into an ending. And because denial refuses the ending, the mind keeps returning. This is not just curiosity, it's unfinished grief. even for people who never knew the victim. Humans grieve symbolically. When a story carries meaning, we grieve its disruption. And denial blocks symbolic grief, because symbolic grief requires recognition. So the case keeps haunting. Now, another reason this case haunts us is polarization. Denial produces camps. People who believe, people who condemn, people who doubt, people who see conspiracy. Once camps form, the case becomes identity. A person is not just watching a documentary. They are defending a worldview. The system is fair. The system is corrupt. Media is truthful. Media is manipulative. People are readable. People are masks. These are not small beliefs. So the case becomes larger than itself. And when a case becomes larger than itself, it becomes permanent. Because debates about worldviews do not end. They only shift forms. Now, there's another layer of haunting, the normal monster phenomenon. Some cases haunt because the offender looks like what we imagine an offender should look like. But this case haunts because the offender did not fit the caricature many people expected. This does not mean guilt or innocence. It means the offender's presentation created a cognitive challenge for the public. They saw an ordinary face, an ordinary posture, a controlled demeanor. And the human brain doesn't like cognitive challenges in moral situations. We want villains to be obvious. We want danger to look like danger. But when danger looks normal, we feel unsafe. So we return to the case, trying to answer the question, what do we miss? That question is haunting because it implicates the viewer. It makes them imagine themselves in the situation. Could I be fooled? Could I be deceived? Could I live with someone like that? The case becomes personal, and personal cases haunt longer. Now, the final reason this case haunts us is philosophical. Denial forces the public to confront the idea that truth is not automatically victorious. We like stories where truth rises, where guilt is admitted, where remorse appears, where justice includes recognition. Denial challenges that narrative. It suggests that truth can exist without being acknowledged by the person who committed the harm. And that feels like injustice on a different level. Not legal injustice, existential injustice. Because it means the world may never receive the moral confirmation it wants. And when the world doesn't receive confirmation, it keeps seeking it. That is haunting. Now, bring all these elements together. A symbolically clear victim, a betrayal inside intimacy, a media event imprinted on culture, a challenge to emotional readability, a lack of confession, a polarized ecosystem, a normal presentation in a catastrophic context, and a philosophical wound. Truth without acknowledgement. This combination creates a case that does not settle. It stays alive because it never resolves emotionally, even if it resolves legally. And that is the key point. Legal endings are not always psychological endings. Denial blocks psychological endings. Now we move into the final chapter, because if this case haunts us, it's not enough to describe why. We need to ask what it means, what it teaches us about denial, not as entertainment, but as a psychological phenomenon with moral consequences. In the final reflection, we will return to the central idea of this documentary. Denial is not simply the refusal to admit a crime. It is the criminal mind's resistance to truth when truth threatens identity more than punishment does. And when truth is resisted this deeply, silence becomes more than absence. Silence becomes an endpoint that never arrives. At the beginning of this documentary, we said something that sounds simple but carries a heavy weight. Denial is not only what a person tells other people, it is what a person builds inside themselves. Now, after walking through the layers, the functions, and the long-term structure of denial, we can see the truth more clearly. Denial is not merely resistance to facts. It is resistance to identity collapse. And that is why denial can survive evidence, consequence, prison, and time. Because denial is not always maintained for the world. It is maintained for the self. This is the part many people struggle to accept. We want wrongdoing to trigger automatic moral surrender. We want guilt to force confession. We want conscience to produce collapse. But conscience is not identical in every mind. and identity defenses can be stronger than guilt. In some people, truth does not break denial. Truth threatens it. So denial becomes the mind's survival strategy. It becomes an operating system, a way of staying intact in a reality that would otherwise destroy the self-story. That is why denial can feel colder than lying, because lying implies the truth is known and hidden. Denial can imply the truth is psychologically unacceptable. And when something is unacceptable, the mind does not negotiate. It builds walls. Now, if you step back, you can see that denial operates in a tragic paradox. Denial protects the denier from collapse, but also prevents moral repair. It blocks acknowledgement. It blocks recognition. It blocks the emotional endpoint that victims' families and the public crave. So denial becomes a second harm, not because it changes what happened, but because it refuses to name what happened. And naming matters. Naming is how the human mind stabilizes after trauma. Naming is how reality becomes solid again. This is why so many families say the same thing, year after year. We just want the truth. Not because truth brings the person back, but because truth brings the world back into alignment. Denial keeps the world misaligned. It keeps reality contested. It keeps grief trapped. And when grief is trapped, a case remains alive forever. Now, here is the hardest truth in this entire documentary. Sometimes denial is not broken. Sometimes there is no confession. Sometimes there is no emotional endpoint. Sometimes the person never yields recognition, and the world must accept that, not as forgiveness, as reality. Because just as denial is a defense mechanism, so is our desire for confession. Our desire for confession is a defense against uncertainty. It is a defense against the idea that the offender can remain psychologically intact. It is a defense against the idea that truth can exist without acknowledgement. So confession comforts us. It tells us moral gravity exists. It tells us consequences reach inside. It tells us that eventually the human mind must face itself. Denial removes that comfort. It suggests that some minds can avoid self-recognition indefinitely. And that possibility is haunting. Now, if we return to the Scott Peterson case as the lens for this topic, the deeper fascination is not only did he do it, or what happened. The deeper fascination is this. What kind of psychological structure allows a person to resist truth in the face of permanent consequence? Whether you believe is denial or not, the mechanism is worth studying because it reveals something about the human mind. Reality is not only something we perceive. Reality is something we can defend against. And when identity is threatened, the mind may prefer defense over truth. This is why denial can become a life sentence. Not only in the legal sense, in the psychological sense. Because if a person spends years defending a story, the story becomes their home. And leaving that home becomes impossible, even if the home is a prison. This is what we meant when we said time can fossilize denial. Time does not always erode a defense. Time can make a defense permanent. Now, what does this teach us beyond this case? It teaches us to be careful with easy conclusions, to be careful with reading guilt from emotion alone, to recognize that emotional display is not a lie detector, to understand that denial can be conscious deception, but it can also be internal survival architecture. And it teaches us something about danger that is uncomfortable. Danger is not always loud. Control is not always aggressive. Some of the strongest forms of resistance are quiet, withholding, refusal, emotional silence. A person can control a narrative not through force, but through the refusal to surrender an endpoint. Now, there's also a moral lesson here, and it matters. If denial can protect an offender, it can also harm victims indefinitely. So as we talk about denial psychologically, we cannot romanticize it. We cannot treat it as just a mental phenomenon. Denial has consequences. It changes how families grieve. It changes how society remembers victims. It changes whether a tragedy is allowed to rest. So the psychological insight does not remove moral weight. It explains the mechanism, but it does not excuse the outcome. And this is the line your channel lives on. Understanding the mind without excusing the act. Now, if you've watched this far, I want to leave you with one question. Not about Scott Peterson, but about denial itself. What do you believe denial is protecting? Is it innocence? Is it strategy? Or is it something deeper? An identity that cannot survive truth? Because if denial is identity protection, then denial is not always a choice in the way we imagine. It becomes a structure, and structures don't fall easily. They fall only when the person inside them is willing to become someone else. And that is the real endpoint denial refuses. Transformation. So if this documentary has done its job, it should leave you with clarity and discomfort. Clarity that denial is not simply lying. Discomfort that truth is not always victorious inside the human mind. If you want to follow up, the next logical documentary is this. The Psychology of Confession. What finally breaks a criminal mind? Because confession isn't just truth-telling. Confession is the moment identity collapses and something new is forced to take its place. If you want that episode next, leave a comment with the words, Confession Psychology. And if you're here for deep psychological documentaries like this one, subscribe. Because on this channel, we don't chase headlines. We study the mechanisms behind them. We study the part that most people never see, the mind. If you made it to the end, you already understand this case on a different level. So here's my question. Do you think denial is usually a conscious lie or a psychological survival system? Write your answer in the comments with lie or survival. And if you want more deep psychological documentaries like this, subscribe, because every episode here is built to explain the why, not just repeat the headlines.